My name is Ruth. I am 34 years old today, and I am autistic, and this is the story of my life so far. On my third birthday, I learnt something important, so shocking that I burst into tears. I was devastated that I hadn't grown, that I wasn't any taller than I was the day before when I was 2. Apparently, when people said I'd be bigger when I was 3, they didn't mean what I thought they meant. In response, my mum started a tradition of measuring me on my birthday and my half-birthday. I learnt that while you don't grow overnight on your birthday, it is a good day to set aside time to notice that you have. With this video, I'm restarting the tradition in a different form. As my first birthday video, we've got a lot of catching up to do. So this story starts almost a lifetime ago, when I was just Ruth, who didn't know I was autistic, who didn't even know there was a word waiting to go on a journey with me, who was better at making friends with numbers than with people, but who was just starting to realise there was something a bit different about me, that my story was in need of a because. This realisation started with something most people take for granted, and by most people, I mean neurotypicals, who, incidentally, generally don't realise they are neurotypicals, that there is a word waiting to go on a journey with them too. This is 2 people having a conversation. One person shares an idea, and the other person responds. There's a reply, a question, an elaboration, and then a new topic, and over here, to the side, is the other part of this story. This is me not talking. This not talking from me is a problem. I've long known it's a problem because people in my life kept telling me that it is. It makes other people feel awkward, they worry about what I'm thinking, or feel bad that they're not making me feel comfortable. So, if I know it's a problem, why do I keep doing it? Well, from my perspective, the strange and unusual thing in that conversation is not me not talking. That's normal for me, and I've been me all my life. The truly extraordinary thing to me is that neurotypicals can talk in conversations. In each exchange in that conversation, their brains are converting sounds into words, words into meaning. They process the meaning and come up with new ideas, ideas back into words, words back into sounds. And it all happens so quickly in the blink of an eye. One conversational exchange flowing seamlessly into another. How do they do it all so quickly? It certainly isn't like that for me. Each step in that process takes a little bit longer, is a bit more deliberate, requires just a bit more concentration. My autistic processing means I don't fit into the gaps in neurotypical conversations. Sometimes I would try really, really hard to think of something to contribute, only to realise the conversation had already moved on 3 ideas. Sometimes I could only put one sentence into words before I had to pause to chase down the words for the next, which was enough for someone else to jump in and move the conversation away from me. I was so often not talking because when these are your choices, not talking just seems like the better option. Sometimes I did talk, but generally only when I knew the person well and we had a shared interest in common. And unfortunately for me, maths is not a widely shared interest. Thank Joe Rowling for Harry Potter. As I got older, these differences stood out more and more. If you know any young children, you might have noticed that they all have difficulty knowing when it's their turn to talk and their turn to not talk. But by the time you get to high school, you're meant to have got the hang of this. You need to be ready to move on to more advanced conversational skills, such as gossiping and bitching. I started to realise that I had a cognitive impairment that was preventing me from being judgmental, and that I needed to work on this if I wanted to fit in. For a while I did try, but I gave up when I found out I was saying hurtful things to my friends without realising why. Back in the late 90s, there wasn't a lot of information that could help me make sense of what was going on. So instead, I had to try to make my own observations and figure it out on my own. One of these observations were conversations. These conversations stood out because even though I still wasn't saying much, the other person didn't seem concerned. They thought that the hmms were a sign I was listening. I came to realise that lots of people actually really like being listened to and not judged. And if you can convince them that you're not being judgmental, they'll tell you what they really think. Which, take it from me, is incredibly helpful if you're autistic living in a neurotypical world. Conversations were a really intriguing option for me because they don't actually need a huge amount of processing. Once you've got a good listening expression, you can basically skip the processing and coming up with ideas bit and just say something that encourages the other person to keep talking. So I decided if getting good at being judgmental wasn't an option for me, maybe I could get good at listening and being accepting instead. For a long time, I thought, problem solved. People felt uncomfortable when I wasn't talking, but really liked it when they were listened to. So, all I needed to do was convince them that the not talking was actually good listening and everyone would be happy. But over time, I started to realise there were lots of things I didn't understand about the conversations, such as why the other person would suddenly decide they were over, or what I should do if there was something I really wanted to talk about. Or, actually, how I could have any influence on the conversation at all. Once the other person had left, I was left on my own with all these ideas I'd just listened to. All this accumulated meaning bouncing around in my head, demanding to be thought about. It turned out that after I'd processed it, I often had a lot of new ideas I'd like to share with someone. Just no one was left to share them with. At some point, maybe when I was 14 or 15, I first discovered the island of listening. I realised that I could go in my head and imagine the other person was still there, and not as they were in real life, but as the best listener in the world. They never interrupted or cut the conversation short. They just sat there, interested in everything I had to say. And I needed this, because sometimes I spent hours trying to find the words to express my ideas, going back over the same thing multiple times. And the other person just sat there patiently, looking encouraging. A lot of my conversations fell into a pattern. I would spend the real conversation listening to what other people had to say, and then have an imaginary conversation where they listened to me. And for a long time, I thought everyone was happy with this. In a completely unrelated development, or so I thought, high school was also the time that I started to realise how much I love public speaking. Don't get me wrong, I still get nervous, often to the point that I'm physically shaking, and I sometimes worry about what other people will think. But overall, public speaking really works for me. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, you usually get told well in advance that you have to give a talk. So, while all my classmates might be worrying about having to stand up and speak in front of everyone, all I could think was thinking time. Lots and lots of thinking time. The second really awesome thing about public speaking is that there's a really clear social cue to tell you when it's your turn to start talking. And there's also a really, really, really strong social rule that other people aren't allowed to interrupt you to talk about something completely different. Public speaking really works for my brain, so I did reasonably well at it to start with, certainly compared to regular conversations. As I realised this, I started to put the effort in to get good at it. When one of my talks didn't go so well, I spent ages dissecting it, trying to work out why. By the time I started giving talks at conferences towards the end of undergrad, I knew what I had to do to give a good one. And then I realised something amazing. Afterwards, people in the audience would approach me and say things like, "Ruth, I thought your talk was great." And then, even better, "Here's what I thought about your ideas." This was brilliant because it meant I could skip the introducing myself to other people I don't know, making small talk, talking about them, all the stuff I didn't know how to do, and just get to the bit where they respond to my ideas. This was when I realised that there was a limitation to sharing my ideas with imaginary people inside my head. They couldn't respond in ways that I couldn't imagine. I wanted to be able to share my ideas with other people, to be able to communicate them in a way that other people understood, so I could find out how they responded. But to do that, I needed a lot of time to structure my ideas, and I only got to give talks once or twice a year. Another of those completely unrelated developments, I started to get involved in teaching. At the end of high school, it was informally helping my friends. At uni, I started tutoring at the maths camp I attended as a high school student, and shortly after, demonstrating in labs and running tutorials. And I realised I love teaching. It probably won't surprise you to hear that there are a number of things about teaching that really suit my brain. For a start, there's a really strong expectation that teachers should think about what they're going to talk to students about before they get to class. So strong that they often actually pay you to do this. In a physics tutorial, it's also socially acceptable to spend a lot of time talking about maths and physics. But my favourite thing about teaching is that when teachers have an idea they want to share, it is completely acceptable to go up to a group of people involved in their own conversations and tell them to stop talking and listen to what you have to say. I love teaching. Once again, I realised that teaching was something that worked for my brain, and so I decided I was going to put the effort in to be good at it. But it turned out that teaching is more complicated than giving a presentation. My first challenge was probably not what you're expecting. There is a tradition that all the tutors at the maths camp have to tell a joke one evening. And the awesome thing about this, from my perspective, is that I knew this well in advance. With preparation time, I could look up all the maths jokes I could find, do a comparative analysis of the funny versus not funny ones, and use these insights to plan my own joke. Which, I'm pleased to be able to tell you, the audience placed in the category of funny. The next challenge is probably more predictable. I realised that I could say something completely sensible, reasonable and correct, like force equals mass times acceleration, and yet the majority of my students seemed to have no idea what I was on about. This was the most incomprehensible and important problem I had ever come across in all of my studies of maths and physics. What could I do but change the topic of my PhD to teacher-student interactions? And then finally, I noticed something that I really wished wasn't true. I noticed that a lot of the other tutors were having conversations with their students about things that weren't maths or physics, and that these conversations seemed to make their students more motivated to learn about maths and physics. It seemed that teaching was not a way to get around the not talking thing after all. By this point, I had developed a number of close friendships with people who, now I look back, were all extraordinary listeners. But I had no idea how this happened, why they chose to be friends with me, how to tell if someone was my friend. Even working out that I wanted to be friends with someone seemed to take me at least 10 times as long as it did everyone else. Making friends was largely a matter of waiting for other people to decide they wanted to be friends with me. And I'd started to hear a lot about a word that sounded a lot like my missing because. So I picked up my courage and made an appointment with the ANU counselling service, which was a very scary prospect because I also didn't know how to end a relationship with a psychologist, or actually anyone, if it wasn't working out. I got lucky. The psychologist I was assigned was extraordinarily good at listening and was able to explain conversations to me. Slowly, so I had time to process. It was also the start of a long journey of self-discovery that included a formal diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and became an adventure in self-acceptance. But on a very practical level, I am now able to talk to people I don't know about topics that aren't maths and physics. Still a bit slowly, still a bit awkwardly, still not in large groups, and still it's tiring. But enough that I can do it when I need to or want to. I also worked out what was going on in the heads of my students. Most of them were having difficulty with maths and physics, like I had difficulty with conversations. A few were having difficulty discussing maths and physics because they had difficulty with conversations, just like I had difficulty with conversations. We were all trying to learn something we found difficult and scary in a system that assumed we would find it intuitive and straightforward. We were overwhelmed by the processing demands, meaning we had no brain capacity to consider what we wanted from the interactions. We realized that some conversations were not safe places for us to be so vulnerable, so we disengaged to protect ourselves. Because when these are your choices, not talking, not trying, just seems like the better option. When it came down to it, we're not that different at all, really. Not that different at all. Once I realized this, I knew the teacher I needed to become. One who will never judge you for missing the obvious or for taking a long time to process. One who believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. Who will listen patiently as you search for the words that belong with your ideas. Who finds everything you say interesting. Who will help you to understand that the problem is the system and not you. Who can create a space where it is safe for you to be vulnerable, where you have room to empower yourself and to find your own because. Who gets that learning itself is a political act, a rebellion against everyone who thought we weren't good enough. A teacher who wants, with all my heart and my mind and my soul, for you to be able to go, however, in the direction of your dreams. Not that much to ask of myself. I've spent a lot of time worrying whether I am good enough. What if I fail? Who am I to presume this could be me? But eventually I looked around and noticed the complete lack of people lining up to take on that role in my students' lives. When I looked at it from that perspective, how could I not try? And I spent a lot of time worrying about how to separate this from my research, how to keep my PhD detached from me. But I finally realized it ain't happening. All research is biased, and I need to own the biases in mine. Because of who I am, I always assumed that teaching happened across neurodiversity, where mind-reading failures were a daily, or actually perhaps even minutely, occurrence. So I developed a theory to help teachers or students catch mind-reading failures before they get out of hand. I think it's so good that I use it myself. My methodology might not fit with your ideas of how research should be done. There's not a lot of objective experiments or any claims of statistical significance. Fine, we don't have to agree. But if you're interested in rugged theory that's been battle-tested by both teachers and students in some of the most challenging interactions, keep in touch. With so many helpful ideas bubbling up, my PhD was starting to create some communication problems of its own. I had to explain my ideas about how the ideas of teachers lead them to misinterpret the ideas of students and how these ideas are different than the ideas that other scholars have had about this idea. No matter how I tried, there were just too many ideas and not enough sentence. It took me years trying out every piece of writing advice I could find before I realized I needed to be able to organize and reorganize and reorganize and reorganize and reorganize and reorganize my ideas before I tried to put them into sentences. It came as a shock to discover that once I could hit the right ideas to sentence ratio, I was actually a seriously good writer. Which means, at age 34, I no longer have to rely on imaginary people when I want someone to listen to me. I can do something like this video, or write a letter, record a message, explain why I need the other person to just stop talking. The mechanics of conversation no longer take up all of my processing, and I have space to think about what I want from the interaction. Today, I want to say something that I've been wanting to say to all my people ever since I was 13. I really hate it when people prompt me to talk with suggestions of what I could say, or jump into my silence with suggestions of what I can do. I love it when you ask me questions or expand on something I've said. My issue is when you interrupt my silence with your ideas for what I could say. While I appreciate the good intentions, you're assuming that I desperately want to say something, anything, to fit in, and the reason that I'm not saying anything is that I don't have any ideas for things I could say. This is wrong. I am not an actor to be scripted. I am not a puppet on your strings. I would rather say nothing than live my life as a pale imitation of sorta, kinda, someone else. I am Ruth. I don't fit any of the identity labels created by neurotypicals. I want to think like a Ruth, feel like a Ruth, live like a Ruth, be a Ruth. If you want to talk to someone who conversations like a neurotypical, thinks like a neurotypical, feels like a neurotypical, go talk to someone who is a neurotypical and leave me alone because I don't want to talk to you. However, if you do want to talk to me, here is what I need you to understand. I am done with thinking that I need to get better at talking so we can have a conversation, that the problems in our relationship are all due to my autism. If you want to have a conversation with me, you need to get different at listening. We can work out the details together, but you need to be willing to rethink your assumptions about how conversations work. And when I listen to you, be warned, because I will really listen. I will hear more than you tell me. I will see you without your labels. I will see past your fears and your what-ifs and your worries that you aren't good enough. And I will realize that what I expected is true. You are brilliant and wonderful and full of potential. Because that is what I always realize when I give someone my full attention. The next thing I need you to know is that I no longer use autistic to mean someone who has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder as an identity label created by neurotypicals. Our journey has come a long way since then. If you combine the prefix aut with the suffix ism, you get a word that could mean the state of being oneself, the practice of being oneself, the philosophy based around being oneself. I use it to mean all of these and more. And doesn't that just sum up everything that's wrong about our world? That we looked at the word autism and thought, sounds like a good name for a disorder? To be clear, I'm not saying that there are no difficulties or impairments associated with what psychologists call a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. But those difficulties and impairments should not be confused with being quirky, different, seeing things from a unique perspective. And by calling the state of being oneself a disorder, we are doing exactly that. If you turn autism into autistic, you get someone who possesses characteristics of practicing autism, someone who values people as themselves, someone who dedicates time to understanding themselves and other people as themselves. So yes, I am fucking proud to be able to call myself autistic. So today, on my 34th birthday, I am not the person I was when I was 3, or even when I was 33. And autism doesn't mean to me what it did when I was younger. I look forward to discovering who I will be when I'm 35, and I wonder what autism will mean in my future. But now it is the present, And I still agree with my 3-year-old self that the best thing about birthdays is the presents. So I would like to ask for a gift from you. I would like you to think of someone you have overlooked, someone whose labels you saw instead of themselves, and just see whether you can listen to them differently, with the purpose of confirming my belief that they, like you, like me, are fucking brilliant and fucking wonderful and fucking full of fucking potential.